Imagine a complete collapse of the mind, mapped out not as a medical diagnosis, but as a rigid physical event occurring entirely inside your skull. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear. And I and silence, some strange race, wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. To understand how this poem achieves its intense psychological grip, we have to examine its mechanical construction and the history hidden in its original manuscripts. Assigned number 280, or 340 in modern variorum editions, this poem was drafted between late 1861 and early 1862. Scholars refer to this period as the author's flood year. Cocooned in her family home in Amherst, Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson produced hundreds of poems in this brief window, many of them rigorously charting extreme states of mental anguish and psychic disintegration. Notice the phrasing here. Dickinson completely removes the safety of a simile. There are no distancing words bridging the gap between the event and the observer. The speaker does not feel like a funeral is happening. She is literally hosting the physical event, complete with mourners, inside her own head. By utilizing the rigid, concrete choreography of a 19th century New England funeral, Dickinson creates a mechanical blueprint to map an entirely abstract event, the collapse of human consciousness. The creeping dread of the poem is engineered directly through its technical prosody, starting in the very first stanza. The meter alternates strictly between 8 and 6 syllables. This common meter is intimately associated with the comforting cadence of church hymns, but Dickinson subverts this immediately, injecting heavy gerunds, treading, creating a claustrophobic rhythm that escalates to a hypnotic drum, beating. This relentless noise leads to a highly ambiguous threshold, the realization that sense was breaking through. The phrasing presents a terrifying split in interpretation. It asks whether rational sanity is finally fracturing under the pressure, or if the rational mind is desperately trying to comprehend the incoming flood of madness. Through strict metrical repetition, the text bridges the gap to the reader, simulating the sensory overload and deep psychological numbing described by the speaker. The ritual progresses in the third stanza. The casket, the box, is lifted, initiating a new, heavier phase of the funeral. Because Dickinson bound her poems at home in handmade packets called fascicles, scholars can track her intent by looking at handwritten variants left in the margins. The manuscript for fascicle 16 reveals a crucial editorial choice. She originally drafted the line to read, "Creak across my brain," but physically crossed it out. In its place, she substituted the word soul. That single substitution moves the poem away from a localized neurological symptom. It elevates the text into a profound spiritual crisis. The mourners step directly onto her spiritual foundation, their footsteps gaining an unbearable, crushing gravity as they walk with boots of lead. Violating the soul breaks the physical confines of the skull entirely. The breakdown is no longer local, it is preparing to become cosmic. The spatial transition is violent. The interior of the head shatters, expanding outward into the terrifying infinite void of space. The auditory landscape shifts alongside the setting. The localized beating drum expands into a massive, deafening church bell tolling across the cosmos. Stripped of her environment, the speaker is reduced to a single point of consciousness, marooned, and described as wrecked, solitary, here. The physical mourners, the wooden casket, and the organized service have all vanished from the text. Nothing remains but the overwhelming reverberation. Dickinson dissolves the concrete social ritual established in the first stanza into pure abstract terror, severing the speaker from all earthly tethers. This brings us to the catastrophic structural failure of the fifth stanza and then a plank and reason broke. Here, we see an inversion of a common 19th century Puritan trope. Sermons of the era frequently depicted Christian faith as a single wooden plank, keeping a precarious sinner suspended over the fires of hell. Dickinson rewrites the theology. In her version, it is reason, the capacity for rational thought itself, that snaps in half. The floor gives way, and the speaker plummets, falling past entire worlds. These passive steers represent her previous memories, deeply held beliefs, and past realities slipping out of reach. The breaking of the plank marks the final, irreversible threshold of sanity. There is no structural foundation left to catch her, and no possibility of returning to the organized world. Fast forward to 1896, a full decade after Dickinson's death, when this poem was finally prepared for its public debut. The responsibility of bringing her hidden fascicles to the public fell to early editors, primarily Mabel Loomis Todd. Todd enlisted Thomas Wentworth Higginson as a co-editor. Higginson had a well-documented history of regularizing Dickinson's idiosyncratic punctuation, grammar, and syntax to make her work more palatable. When they published I Felt a Funeral in their third series of poems, Todd and Higginson made a drastic editorial decision. They completely deleted the fifth stanza. Victorian literary standards demanded neat, moral resolutions. The editors found the plunging abyss of the final stanza far too jarring and structurally unconventional for their audience. By ending the poem prematurely on the loneliness of the fourth stanza, they neutered the text. True existential annihilation was replaced with manageable, acceptable melancholy. Restoring Dickinson's actual final line returns the focus to the true outcome of the fall, and finished knowing then. In her manuscript margins, Dickinson tested an alternate phrasing, and got through knowing then. She ultimately rejected it. Finished knowing is the far more devastating choice. Got through implies surviving the ordeal or crossing over to the other side. Finished denies the reader any implication of survival. The closure relies entirely on the poem's very last keystroke, the dash. In this context, the dash ceases to be a grammatical mark. It acts as the visual representation of sudden, absolute oblivion. The thought does not conclude, it simply stops. By deliberately mapping the edges of the human mind until language itself runs out, Dickinson secures her position as a fearless architect of psychological horror in American literature.